Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good wherever you are. So, usual procedure, camera on if you're on page one, that is, and microphone off wherever you are. And if you have, you can interrupt me by raising your hand digitally, although I might not notice, but somebody will draw attention to me. So if there's some reason you want to interrupt or comment or something, please feel free to do so. So, I suppose I should introduce myself, Martyn Rawson, been around a long time, um, currently working at Alanus and teaching in Hamburg and busy doing lots of writing. Those of you who've looked in research on Steiner education on the new one will see that I've got a couple of articles have just appeared there that have been a long time in the pipeline. So it's great to have a sense that there's lots of you there, 105 apparently, which is wonderful. So I'm going to continue this theme about how something is Waldorf, and my theme is how global is Waldorf. So the friends of Waldorf Education tell us that there are about 1,092 schools and in 64 countries and 1,857 kindergartens in more than 70 countries, it says. And we are very proud of that. Although Montessori has 10,000 and the Soka Gakkai International Global Movement, which was founded by Daisaka Ikeda, Japanese educationalist, is active in 192 countries. So, does that mean that we're not as global as the others are? It's a question of what we mean by global. And I'm going to use my PowerPoint now and again. If I use lots of terminology, I will flip to my PowerPoint and I'd like to give you a kind of iteration of what does global actually mean. So I just quickly share my screen and go to so I guess you can see that, how global, we know that's the question. So global, does it mean eternal? Does it mean archetypal? Does it mean universal? It means global, but does that also mean general? Is it common? Is it typical? You can see that there's quite a lot of different ways of interpreting the term global. McDonald's is global. Apple is global. The internet is global. And the whole process of globalization is something that we're all familiar with. But I don't think Waldorf education would position itself in the same kind of category. Because, of course, the thing about McDonald's is that it's pretty much the same everywhere. They do have some regional variations, I believe, but basically it's the same everywhere and the same with Burger King and the other global brands of fashion, of motor cars, and so on. So clearly that's not really what's meant by us. But if we think, I'll just stop that a moment. If we think, what is it about Waldorf education that we would generally consider is universal? Would we say the 7 year cycles of development of the child? Would we say the curriculum? Would we say the step-by-step matching of the curriculum to the development of the child? So that everywhere, all over the world, grade three children have the same curriculum. Everywhere, all around the world, they have the same grade seven curriculum, and so on. Does phrases like the development of the child is a rather kind of universalistic kind of formulation. What do we actually mean by the child? It's kind of very general and non-specific. What else is there that's we would consider to be universal? If you were drawing up a set of criteria to determine what is Waldorf and what is not Waldorf, as various international institutions have tried to do, then you would probably have things like the 8-year class teacher period as an ideal, something to strive towards. We know that that doesn't always work out. Would we say a Waldorf school has to have two other languages? Does it have to have eurythmy? Does it have to have a college of teachers? Does it have to have a lack of right angle shapes in its architecture? And as a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, used to say, Walter Hiller, some of you here will know him. He used to say, just because you've got a hand carved sign outside the school doesn't make you a Waldorf school. Although it's nice to have a hand carved wooden sign out there. So another old colleague of mine, Dietrich Estel, used to regularly say in the college meetings in Stuttgart, we are not a Waldorf school. We can become a Waldorf school, which actually works better in German than it does in English. But the idea is clear. Waldorf is like an ideal that we can work towards. So defining ourselves as Waldorf is in that sense aspirational. It's something to aspire to. So I think all attempts to define the key characteristics of Waldorf, important though it is, useful though it is, necessary though it is, are always bound to either make it too broad, too diffuse, too imprecise, or too narrow, that somebody would feel excluded because they don't have eurythmy, because they only have one second language or whatever it is, or they only have class teacher, grade teachers till grade 6 or grade 5 or whatever. So this kind of these characteristics is not really what defines Waldorf. And I don't want to look at any of those particular aspects. Some of you who've heard my talks in the past will know that I have argued strongly that there is no such thing as the Waldorf curriculum, and that most of the forms that Waldorf takes are not what makes Waldorf. Um, but I don't wish to go into those individual details too much. I'll come back to those towards the end. Um, One of the things that I think is helpful to do is to perhaps take a step outside the Waldorf movement. And I've been in the Waldorf movement since 1979. I'm still there. I'm active. I'm championing it. I'm convinced that this is the best education that there is. When it's good, it's really good. And even when it's not so good, it's still pretty good. And, I'm a total Waldorf insider. But it's sometimes quite helpful to look at the Waldorf movement through other lenses. So, for example, there's a Welsh literary critic by the name of Raymond Williams, who back in the 1970s um, defined what a revolutionary culture is. He identified himself as being part of a revolutionary culture, and he identified certain characteristics. He said, essentially, a revolutionary culture is characterized by tradition. So the thing about tradition is that it's not simply transporting what was into the present. Tradition is usually constructive. It's usually invented, actually. The invention of tradition is a very famous history book from Hobsbawm, who showed that actually tradition is usually what the people who have most influence decide which elements of the past are important in the present. So traditions are always selective. They're selective of what the current hierarchy, the current central leading figures think is important. They determine what tradition is. And that, interestingly enough, changes and modifies. You think tradition by definition is kind of constant, but it's not. Tradition is something which is created in the moment to establish a narrative about the past. So I think I don't need to draw that out too far. I think it's quite clear that Waldorf has its traditions, and um, they're kind of selective. They've been chosen by the people who matter, the people who have most influence, to determine what the Waldorf movement should identify itself as. The second element that Raymond Williams introduced was he called it residual. So there are traditional elements, but there are residual elements. I'll just put these three concepts up by sharing my screen once more. So we had that one. So traditional, residual, we'll come to the other one in a moment. Residual means people join revolutionary movements and they bring with them aspects, aspirations, ideas from their own biography, from their other interests, and they identify that with the movement that they're joining. In other words, they bring that in from outside. And in fact, they tend to see the basic ideas of the movement as being conform with their hopes and aspirations. Just to give you a very simple example, after the 1968 generation, student revolt and so on, was followed by a period of restructuring amongst the younger generation, a kind of an orientation on the environment, against various forms of centralized authority and so on. And this period, this 1968 generation, coincided with the founding of a lot of new Waldorf schools, which had quite radical new ideas about the way teachers should be paid, about how schools should be autonomous, and lots of other aspects. So they brought elements which were not necessarily inherent in the Waldorf movement up until that point. They brought something in and said, that's what Waldorf is for. Sometimes you encounter people who say, um, what characterizes Waldorf for them is school as a focus for community. And that's particularly the case in countries where parents found Waldorf schools, where schools are very dependent on parents to support and finance them. This idea that school is a community and that therefore parents have to have some kind of say in the process. Now, you can look far and wide for the involvement of parents in school governance in the first school, or indeed for the first decades of Waldorf education. Parents were clearly there, they were important, there were parents' evenings and so on, but they were not, it was not the expectation that school would be a focus for community. So this is something that people who had that aspiration brought into it. By the way, the influence of the Camp Hill movement on the Waldorf movement has been profound, particularly from the 70s onwards. Many Camp Hill communities, the co-workers helped to found Waldorf schools for their children. That's particularly the case in the United Kingdom, but it, as far as I know, was also true in other places. These Camp Hillers brought ideas which Karl Koenig brought into the Camp Hill movement about community living, about not paying people salaries on a needs-based system. And this was always kind of in a superficial way connected to Steiner's threefold social order. But actually, if you look at what influenced Karl Koenig most, was his time in the Moravian Brotherhood. He brought ideas from this community of Christians who wanted to form a, they wanted to sort of take Christianity back to its roots and be community and so on. He brought that into Camp Hill. Camp Hill people brought that into founding Waldorf schools. One of them was the one that I was involved in founding. And we just assumed that was it. That was part of, that's what Waldorf was. But of course, there were other schools who didn't have that. There were much older schools who didn't have that. So you can see how this residual element comes in. The third element is emergent. In other words, a revolutionary movement has, on the one hand, tradition. It is a kind of it's a reflective surface for people's individual biographical aspirations and ideas. But out of that, something new, something emerges, and that is the actual revolutionary movement. in Raymond Williams's terms. So personally, I feel part of such, I can identify with this idea of emergence. I can identify with the fact that my long career in Waldorf has gone through these phases, that I encountered it, as we all did, as a tradition. This is the way we do things here. This is what we believe in. This is why we do that. I didn't actually read Steiner directly to find those things out. And it's actually quite hard, quite often, to find out what did Steiner actually say about this, that, and the other. It's much easier, in a way, to simply adopt practices, and especially if they're meaningful, and just assume that that's where it comes from. So I personally, no doubt, brought my own biographical interests, and I brought a whole load of interests that belonged to my generation into my action of Waldorf. For example, I was just writing something today. I was asked to write something quickly about main lesson books. And I had an interesting correspondence with Detlef Hardop, who just published in the last Research on Steiner Education an article on the main lesson book. And we discovered that the references to a main lesson book by Steiner, you could literally write on a postcard. They're very, very few. And there's very little evidence that in the first Waldorf school, this was widely practiced. In fact, the earliest known main lesson book is from 1926, 1927. Nana Goebel apparently has one or has access to one. She wrote an article in a book in Germany about this first illustrated main lesson book. It's a wonderful tradition. It's a unique tradition. Nobody else in the world does this, which is why in Germany, an academic book with something like 18 contributions from different authors on different aspects of the main lesson book. But the interesting thing is, you can look all the way through this book. There are hardly any references, in a sense. It's a tradition that has developed in a way on a few kind of indications, a few basic ideas. I don't want to go into that. It's a very interesting topic, and there's absolutely nothing. I mean, main lesson books are a wonderful institution, but they show how this process, they were in a sense emergent. Yeah. They emerged pretty early on out of the practice of Waldorf by bringing ideas together that made sense, the self-activity of the children, dispensing with pre-processed, pre-digested textbooks and so on. It encourages the teachers to be creative and to make a personal relationship. Above all, it enables the students to express and articulate themselves, and it has all kinds of practical benefits. It's a wonderful emergent idea, but you could not say that it was like introduced as a key factor at the beginning. So the thing is, if we are looking to establish what is universal or what is even widespread in Waldorf education, we need to kind of first of all clarify a little bit about the status of the knowledge that we need in order to answer this question. Now, I'm picking up a little bit on the first talk from last week from Jost, but I'm going to dig back a little bit deeper. But something he said reminded me. He said a number of things, but two things that immediately resonated with me. One was that for the Greeks, for the ancient Greeks, thinking was a form of perception. Thoughts were perceived. And that Steiner himself said that thoughts are the forces within things. Concepts, thoughts are the processes within things. That's quite an interesting, that led me down a path to explore this. So what kind of knowledge does Waldorf education actually require? And here I'd like to go back to the Greeks and look at two different kinds of knowledge that we find by the Greeks. The first is episteme. This is eternal, global, archetypal, universal, unchanging knowledge. It's independent of the person who discovers it or articulates it. It's deemed to be always true. In other words, it is the truth. And the examples that I pick out of the air are truth, love, but also things like gravity, speed of light, radioactive decay. These are things which, as far as we know, have always been true, or certainly as long as people have been around with the kind of sentient systems that we have today, then uh, gravity has been a fact of life. Yeah, that's one form of knowledge. The second form of knowledge is phronesis, which is usually translated as practical wisdom. Aristotle describes phronesis in his Nicomachean Ethics as situated. It's changing, evolving, it's experiential, it's always relative in the context. It's relative to the context in which it is produced. In other words, an example of that would be pedagogical judgment, or an aesthetic response, or an ethical response of knowing what is right and what is wrong. So that makes phronesis both ethical, personal, and what it doesn't say there is subjective. So this practical wisdom is which of those two kinds of knowledge, which of those two ways of knowing is actually better than saying knowledge, but knowing, a way of knowing? Which of those two is more appropriate for Waldorf education? Now, there are people who would believe that it's the first one, episteme. They believe that everything that Steiner said is true, has always been true, will always be true. It's just a kind of fact. And he just because he was an initiate, he can sort of present that to us, and we just somehow have to try and work out and understand what it means. Yeah. The other way of interpreting would be to say that Waldorf education depends on teachers being able to read the situation, read the child, read the context in the moment. And therefore, they will be making judgments, they will be making knowledge which is not deemed to last forever. It's not for all time. It's true, perhaps, hopefully, now in this situation, in this moment. And above all, it's knowledge that you generate. It's not inherited. It's not tradition. It's emergent. Yeah. So if we just, I can't actually remember what the next slide. Ah, yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, we go back to what Jost was talking about, Steiner's theory. I've called it his theory of knowing. We usually say theory of knowledge, but knowledge kind of suggests something which is fixed, but it's actually a theory of how we know about things. And if we know about something, then we experience the reality of it. And that involves us having experiences, which Steiner calls percepts, that these percepts are given meaning intuitively in our thinking because we find a concept that makes sense of the experience. Now we know that this process has changed, or at least we take Rudolf Steiner's advice on this, and it definitely does seem to be the case because he's clearly not the only person who has identified that the way we know has changed. And that's what Jost was talking about last week when he introduced Descartes' cogito ergo sum. And this whole question of how do we know what we know and who am I in that process? And what Steiner clearly pointed out by comparing, for example, people of today with people ancient Greeks, we do not perceive thoughts directly. Our the way our mind, the way our sensory organization is today, is that we experience percepts, we construct representations of it, mental images. And I thought that I don't know whether Jost actually said this, but I wrote it down that Jean-Paul Sartre had said something like the idea of a dog cannot bite you. I suppose more poetic would be that the idea of a loaf of bread will not nourish you. So we are separated from the direct experience of reality, and therefore we have to bring about a reality, we have to create a reality for ourselves. And let me just stop that for a moment. Um, this idea of our ability to read the world directly has clearly changed. We are only experiencing a kind of an indirect, a representation of what we experience. And therefore, we need ideas, we need concepts to interpret it. And we also need to know what to direct our attention to. That's an important part of it. Now, this idea about the Greeks set me thinking, because I also teach art history and so on.
Matthijs, vertel je steeds af naar aarde. Ik verzekер.
Somebody needs to turn off their microphone. Um, we need to perhaps it's helpful to just to go back, just to kind of remind ourselves of what this might mean, that the Greeks could experience ideas, thoughts in what they perceived and probably translated that into artistic expression. So we'll just go back to that slide and then go to the next one. So this is a very famous, so famous that I have to borrow from the internet a copy of it from the Science Photo Library. This is from the Parthenon, the British Museum. This is a triangular set of figures with various crucial pieces missing, um, but you can get a general impression. And if we look at that in a little bit more detail, then what you see is an incredible. I mean, we have to get over the fact the heads are missing and hands are missing. Okay, but try and sort of add those in. Look at the flow of the garments. Now, women in Greek art were usually clothed. This gave the artist, of course, a great advantage because the clothing, um, the robes, the veils, and so on, clinging to the body, moving in the wind, moving with the way the figure is supposed to be moving, can make visible, if you like, processes that you wouldn't otherwise see, and then to translate them into movement. And I just quoted from the catalogue from the British Museum. It says she, that's the figure to the from your side to the left, supposed to be Aphrodite. And the two other remarkable figures with her are draped in diaphanous tissue. This pours like water and around their feminine forms, emphasizing swelling breasts and abdomens, rounded shoulders, knees and thighs, and linking one erogenous zone with another, transforming cold marble into warm living flesh. Goes a little bit further than we usually discuss in art history, but it's true. It definitely does all that. It's making visible the kind of the life processes, the life forces in those human beings in a particular way, which gives us a sense of what they are experiencing. And if we go to another famous Greek sculpture, then you have this combination. It actually is interesting because it has both male and female components. The male being the nakedness, if you like, the muscularity, the play of muscles, and at the same time has this wonderful waterfall of drapes. This person, Niobe, has been killed by Zeus, who's hit her in the back with a bolt, and she's dying, and her life forces are draining out of her. They're flowing down onto the floor, as you can see, and her uprightness is giving way. But within that, you can see, I mean, it's not a very good photograph, and you have to see this thing in real life. You can see that underneath the surface, as it were, in the body, are processes, are forces, are streaming forces. In other words, the idea is made visible here. And just so we don't get too sidetracked here, the famous Poseidon figure is a classic example in bronze, what the Greeks can do to build up the dynamic muscular tension to focus an activity into the world. He doesn't even need to have his tripod, which he would have in his right hand. It's always great fun to ask grade nine students to, I always ask them to model the figures that we look at. They have to stand up and take very exactly, and then they don't usually strip off. We try not to do that, but with their everyday clothes, they try to take up the exact posture and then to really feel what it's like, the whole process. And this one is not easy to do because you have to build it up slowly. You have to move from the right foot to the left foot, up to the right arm to the left arm, the gaze of the eye, and so on, emphasized by the pointed beard and so on. And you can see this incredible build-up of energy which is about to be released. Now, we could say great art. It is wonderful, magnificent, global art. But this is, in a way, this kind of illustrates what Rudolf Steiner was talking about. That, and we know that that for the Greeks, paideia, the education of boys, um, went hand in hand with that physical education, the education of the body, the schooling of the body, the rhythmical schooling of the body through gymnastics and so on, through running, through the disciplines, and that hand in hand with recitation of poetry is the education to develop the thinking, to develop the mind. Do you remember that Sophocles was a wrestler? Yeah, a wrestler. How noble is that? Yeah, a wrestler. Perhaps wrestling was different in those days, but he wasn't a great success. But he was far more successful as a musician. In fact, he was allowed to sing in the famous chorus to celebrate the battle, I guess, of Salamis. I can't remember at this moment. But so Sophocles, who we think of as one of the great philosophers, was a wrestler, yeah, was somebody for whom the physical powers were there necessary to, in a sense, to bring his thinking into clarity. So on the one side, there is this kind of intuitive connection to the world. On the other side, we heard about last week, we have a change. We can't do that anymore because what got in the way, in the West, what got in the way was empiricism. Philosophers, actually going quite way back, but famously with people like Roger Bacon, Francis Bacon, John Locke, and so on. These are people who began to say knowledge of the world can be derived by observing the world. And by observing the world, we can read, as it were, the hidden laws governing it, and so on. This is what then became empiricism. And if you like, it came to a sort of culmination with Descartes, and not long after him, Baruch Spinoza. Let me just come back to my PowerPoint again. So there's a list of names: Descartes, John Locke, Spinoza. But long before them, and translating Aristotle, Aristotle, of course, is the first empiricist. Yeah, his knowledge is reading the situation. Yeah. Um, for a long time, it was considered that the Arabs preserved the ideas of Aristotle, translated them, and mediated them in the Middle Ages to the Europeans. But if you actually read the works of Ibn Sina or Ibn Tufayl, then you can see, and we know historically in the meantime, that the ideas of particularly these two and Ibn Tufayl, who wrote a novel, who wrote a developmental novel about a kind of, it's a sort of proto Robinson Crusoe. Only it's a child who grows up on a desert island without any influence from other people, but who teaches himself about the world and becomes very wise, and apart from anything else, practices tolerance of other peoples and so on. A wonderful novel, which, among other people, Baruch Spinoza translated from the Hebrew. It was translated from Arab into Latin, from Latin back into Hebrew and Arabic and so on. Spinoza commissioned or did himself, it's unknown, a translation of this novel. John Locke, likewise, was has a copy, an English copy, and the influence of this empiricism is brought directly and indirectly through literature to these European philosophers. But there's another dimension to this as well, something that Goethe knew all about. We heard about Goethe last week as being a kind of opposite to Novalis in a sense. But both Goethe and Novalis were quite clear that there's another side to empiricism. And that is the side that Rumi and Hafiz, two Persian poets, was the mystical side. They were Sufis. They had a intuitive, mystical experience of the world. Hence the Sufi expression, live in the world, but do not be bound to it. Retain your inner freedom, but live in the world. Don't take yourself away from the world. Don't become monastic or ascetic. Live in the world, but don't be of the world. This mystical side of it, if you like, the path, the Novalis path within towards a spiritual reality, and at the same time, this path of going out through the sense experiences into it. Of course, what's interesting is that Novalis was not just a romantic poet; he was a mining engineer. You know, he was responsible for some of the early brown coal um, excavations and so on. He was a scientist. We know mostly of the other side to him. Likewise with Goethe, we know both sides to Goethe, the scientist, but also the, let's say, the romantic poet, to keep it short. So these two streams, so empiricism actually has different sources that come together in complex ways in Goethe and obviously also in Rudolf Steiner. So, what kind of Waldorf knowledge, what kind of knowledge do we need to base Waldorf education on? I mean, we can't just base it on tradition, and we can't just impose our own particular views on it, the residual views. We have to there has to be an emergent process of knowledge that comes out of it. And this is my humble attempt to identify what do we need as Waldorf practitioners. Well, we need anthroposophical anthropology, what the Germans call Menschenkunde. In other words, the knowledge of the developing human being from an anthroposophical perspective. We need it, but not as fact, but as heuristic. A heuristic is like a kind of, it's like a rule of thumb. It's a kind of a generalized statement which you can then apply and see if it makes sense to you. Now, if we had more time, I could go into this explore this a little bit more deeply. Um, one of the things that Steiner said in Riddles of the Soul, 1917, Seelenrätsel, was he introduced this idea of boundary ideas, Grenzvorstellungen in German, where you take an anthroposophical idea and use it as a lens to look at your experience. And if it proves fruitful, if it reveals more about the phenomenon than you would have done without it, then gradually you assimilate this way of looking at the child, at the developing human being, whatever it is. You assimilate it, and thus you extend the boundary of the limits of your understanding and knowledge, which is why he called it Grenzvorstellung, because it's right on the boundary. It's not sense perceptible. It's definitely not based on empirical science. It's an idea from the spiritual world, but it's one that we can apply and see if it's fruitful, see if it's useful and fruitful. And once we've assimilated it, once we've taken it in, it becomes a new way of seeing. In other words, it becomes a disposition. And the interesting thing is that Steiner said, if you do that, then this boundary idea draws in to us new sources of energy and knowledge. It comes, you take this idea in, and it already draws in a bunch of other possible ideas into it and is regenerating. So that's a very important observation for how to work with these ideas from anthroposophy. Not just say, I studied it, learned it in the seminar, it's true. Yeah. But to actually apply these ideas in situations to the point that you can become, or you not become, you develop then you expand your ability to read the world, your ability to read children, your ability to read pedagogical situations, because you've assimilated this idea, you've made it your own. The second pro is, as I've already said, is this phronesis. This another word for it is pedagogical tact. The phrase pedagogical tact has actually quite a long history, but it's most developed in the 20th century by the German philosopher Gadamer, but also the Canadian philosopher Max van Manen, who originally came from the Netherlands, who has written many books on pedagogical tact. Pedagogical tact is the ability to read the situation in the moment and to act meaningfully. Why it's called pedagogical tact is a longer story, but it's clear. Sometimes Steiner used the word pedagogical instinct. Well, instinct's not quite such a good word for it because instinct is kind of inborn, it's innate. Whereas this is definitely an ability which we have to develop. How do we develop it? For example, by hermeneutic study. That means entering into, let's say, a Steiner text, a text from the foundations or something, and to go through a process of making these ideas your own. I've described this in various books and papers and possibly even here and presented it. I won't go into that. The point is, it enables you to develop a new way of seeing. So this is in a sense linked to the first one. Where do you get these heuristic ideas from? You get them by studying in a certain kind of way in a series of stages. And of course, observation, observation, observation. By observing what we do, by paying close attention, by noticing everything that goes on around us, gradually we begin to notice things through the capacity, through the lens of our boundary ideas, for example, and we begin to develop a kind of um, uh, connoisseurship. I've used this phrase in my new book, connoisseurship. I didn't invent it, obviously. Elliot Eisner, the American educationalist, coined this for teachers. Connoisseurship is, if you like, the corollary of pedagogical tact. Pedagogical tact is knowing in the moment. Connoisseurship is knowing outside of the moment. It's reflecting, it's deliberating, it's thinking about things, it's gathering data, it's doing research, including research using anthroposophical methods, contemplative methods, and so on. I've described this in various places, but I won't go into it now. Until you build up a kind of expertise. A connoisseur is not just somebody who knows a lot about something. A connoisseur is enthused by it. Sometimes connoisseurs can be very boring if you don't share the same interest. Yeah. But connoisseurs among each other, it can be, they could spend all night talking about the thing that they are interested in, whether it's South African wine or whatever it is that you're a connoisseur of. Because to connoisseur from the French, it is to know about, but to know in such a way it transforms you. So it's transformation through knowing, not just through the acquisition of knowledge. Because the thing about connoisseurship is it's learning by experience. You can't become a connoisseur theoretically. So you can see that these are different forms of knowledge that we need. And you could say these processes are common for everybody. I wouldn't say if they're global, but they're certainly common. Now, how do we, just to kind of jump a little bit, how do teachers develop this? And for many years I've been doing research and publishing on a whole question of teacher education and so on, and I've basically come back to where I started from. The classic idea of there being three stages in the professional development. You start as an apprentice. And as an apprentice, you can only do what you've been taught. You can only apply what you've been given. You use the lesson plans, you use the curriculum, you use the methods and structures that somebody more experienced has given you. You don't do it blindly, you do it intelligently, but you don't have much other choice but to simply do that because you cannot afford to experiment with the children. So take advice from somebody who knows a little bit more than you and do it. Use the yellow book curriculum if you have no other choice, because it's not bad, it's just inappropriate if you happen to be in Kuala Lumpur. Once you've done that for a certain number of years, I've no idea how many, it's probably very individual, but let's say traditionally, a 7-year apprenticeship, you become a journeyman or journey person teacher, a journeying teacher. In other words, you can not only apply a whole series of methods, you can manage a class, you can run a lesson, you can deal with parents and all that kind of stuff, but now you begin to be able to reflect on your practice. Compare your practice with what other people are doing. You maybe even begin to do some action research, look at it in detail, talk to people, go to conferences, find out what they're doing. In other words, you don't necessarily have to travel through the world, but you travel through other fields of practice, develop your practice, but you're still not yet in a position to develop Waldorf education anew. Connoisseurship and mastership means that you have many years of experience, you've done it often enough, you've reflected often enough, and now you're in a position to identify what is essential, what I call the generative principles, identify what the generative principles are, and then interpret that in the situation you're on. In other words, what do master teachers do? They apply their connoisseurship, first of all, to guide apprentices. Secondly, to engage in lively dialogue with those journeying teachers who've got all the questions, who have a lot of experience, who are not asking stupid questions, who are asking really intelligent questions, and so on. Dialogue with them. And your job is obviously, first of all, to develop what the apprentices do, but to develop new curriculum, new practices. That is a model, in a sense, which would enable you to develop Waldorf teachers anywhere. Now, what structures you fit that in depends on what's locally available. But those three stages require different kinds of knowledge. To some extent, apprentices deal with fixed existing epistemic knowledge. Not that it's eternal or universal, but it's fixed, it's given. This is how we do it. And gradually you learn to question that. Is that the best way of doing it? Or what would happen if I did it a different way? So the difference between an apprentice and a journeying teacher is a journeying teacher can make accurate observations about the effect of their teaching on the learning behavior of the students. Read the students, not just read the students in an abstract way, oh, what the person's personality, but how does this student respond when I do this, that, and the other? Or when I don't do this, that, and the other, what do the students do? Journeying teachers observe. In other words, they're beginning to develop phronesis, practical wisdom through their observation, and mastership, connoisseurship requires both of those in a balance, and perhaps even the self-development that goes with it. And so, therefore, if you like, finally, in conclusion, I would say that developing and adapting Waldorf education in different times and places, in other words, that which makes it global, is first of all a pedagogical anthropology plus modern insights into child and youth development. There's a tremendous wealth of insight, some of it lost in scientific terminology, some of it in appropriate systems, but there's a lot of people out there thinking about how the mind works, how the brain works, the relationship between movement and so on. Look at some of the work that people like Sebastian Suggett is doing on, looking at the neurology of children's handwriting and things. There are people out there doing science that really sheds light on what we're doing. So, pedagogical anthropology plus more recent insights, of which there are many. The second thing is to identify a set of generative principles, which are also not fixed in stone, but they're between phronesis and episteme. They're kind of, for the moment, this principle works. It's not eternal, it's not set in stone, but it's, as far as we're concerned, it's reliable at this stage. For example, learning is a rhythmical process. For example, the quality of the teacher's preparation corresponds to the quality of learning. That's a generative principle. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, you're doing Waldorf education. If you apply that principle, teaching economy, yeah, maximum amount of content in the minimum amount of time with the minimum amount of effort, but in such a way that no child loses the overview. That's Steiner's idea of teaching economy. It's a generative principle. You can apply it intelligently in any situation you're in. And then the third one is clearly we have to read the developmental tasks of the children, of the young people in the place where we are. What, what is required? What do they need to be able to know and do? How do teaching methods work? When to use teaching methods in which age groups? In other words, we have a whole series of tools, we have instruments that help or hinder the learning process, the teaching and learning process. We need to become journeying teachers by knowing which tools to use in the moment. The apprentice uses the tool that has been given. Use this tool in this situation. Choosing which tool, and then, if you like, the third stage is understanding which tools are required, which content is required, and in which way, and all the other multiple factors that we have to take into account. That makes that makes it, I wouldn't say universal, it certainly makes it widespread, applicable in most places. And therefore, in that sense, I think Waldorf has elements which are global. And what I haven't put here, partly because I didn't have time when I was preparing the slides, is the values. Waldorf education, I'll just stop sharing that. Waldorf education clearly is based on a set of values, which also are like generative principles. Yeah. And I don't wish to write down what those values are or what they should be. I think it's something that we all kind of know in our hearts, and it's also something that we could discuss. What values do we represent? And clearly they belong to the kind of field of human rights, recognition of individuality, non-discrimination, and many things like that. Being artistic, these are kind of values, which at the same time they're not just aspirations far away. It's actually a way of looking at the situation. If I want to enable children from different religious or cultural backgrounds to be together, then I can't just assume that they will develop intercultural competence just simply by being there or because I think it's a good idea. There's a whole series of very practical steps that we would have to take to implement. So values are kind of generative principles that need to be broken down into practical methods. Okay, I think that's probably more than enough. Give everybody a few moments to have a breather. And while you're doing that, I will upload the notes that I've been referring to into the chat. Does anybody strongly disagree? We get that out of the way first of all. Would anybody like to suggest what some of these generative principles or core values might be?
There was a question in the chat. Should I read it to you?
Yes, please. I've lost chat. Oh, there it is.
It's from Nisha Abbott from Aberdeen. She said, "Can we say,
Oh, there.
I hope I say it right, connoisseurship
Connoisseurship, yeah?
could be like moral intuition? It's like it's not far up from what you sent.
Can we say that
Intuition.
connoisseurship could be like moral intuition?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Um, the thing about moral intuition is kind of intuition. Connoisseurship is more deliberated. It's something you think more about. You take time to think about it. Um, you kind of consider, you weigh up, you form a judgment after some. It's not something you can do in the spur of the moment. It's not something you can do in front of a class. Um, it's certainly moral and it certainly has some elements, but it's not quite the same as I understand moral intuition in philosophy of freedom. It's a kind of it's a scaled down. It's between pedagogical tact and knowledge, eternal knowledge. Are there any more?
Yes, there's another one in the
Okay,
chat.
yeah, sorry, I've now just found it again. Are there other professions that might have the transferable skills to fast track one's development as a Waldorf teacher, like astronaut or wrestler? Yeah. Um, well, I think um, all kinds of professional experiences can enrich our work as teachers. And I certainly know that all the kind of ideas connected with Theory U are not perhaps in a direct pedagogical sense, but certainly in understanding um, the organizations we work in and meetings and processes and things are extremely helpful. But I think we kind of take who comes. and or rather, people come from all walks of life into the profession of teacher, and they bring their particular skills with them. Sometimes they bring blind spots with them because they have assumptions in one profession that don't work in Waldorf contexts. But I mean, you can move from one Waldorf school to another Waldorf school, and suddenly it's like going to a different country, in a completely different culture. And so I think the sort of personal, individual character skills are what you can transfer. But clearly, if you're an engineer or a geographer or something and move into those fields in the education, then you bring a degree of authenticity. If you're a practicing artist, if you're a musician, and then you go and teach that, then yeah, that obviously can enrich. Christoph.
Yeah, Martin, thank you very much. I enjoyed your elaborations, one very much, very rich. I have one question. All what you talk now, if we take that together, do we have then the teacher as a artist? My understanding or my striving when I teach is to be a artist, the art of teaching. What you have brought this evening, is that all when we bring it all together, is that the art of teaching, or is it just one part of it? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, actually, I prefer I prefer to say that there's a craft. Teaching is a craft, and I mean that in a
Also,
very
yeah.
high sense. Teaching is a craft. Um, and it's true, everything that we say about crafts, about skills, about doing, if it's worth doing something, it's worth doing something well, understanding the tools and materials, as it were. And at the same time, it's a science. We need to know. We need to know about stuff. And when you bring those together, then if you like, the synthesis of the craft and the science of it enables it to be art. But I'm always a little bit suspicious of maybe I've just had, sometimes in the past, have had this kind of, I have a reaction to people who telling me that teaching is an art. And that therefore teachers are artists. And I always think, well, actually, it's a very odd metaphor that because what's their material? What's their medium? Are they sculpting? Are they shaping? Are they imposing their, and so on? It's a very different kind of art.
Yeah.
It's artistic in the sense of finding a fruitful creative balance. And of course, being creative and innovative, that makes it in that sense artistic. What I think I've been referring to here is that the knowledge side. What is it? Knowledge is usually deemed to be universal, truth, and so on.
Now,
That's why I focused on that aspect of it. But thank you for the question. It's
now that's
helpful enough.
precisely what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, I experienced when I have a parents' evening, and the parents experience that I know that my knowledge about the educational processes and all what you described today is okay. That is not the same as the process when I am in class.
Yeah.
And I'm so very much interested to understand from you how that process is. I believe the unique selling point of Waldorf is education as a art. That there is a certain flow based on knowledge and all what you have described, that there is a certain flow, but that there is a level where the knowledge is not actual part of you, but your interaction with the students is something unique. You can only afterwards grasp it. Do you understand a little bit what I mean? This is very difficult to find the words for it.
I do. I think the way Max van Manen describes pedagogical tact is actually very, very
It's an
close to
element of it.
that. It's an element of it.
Absolutely.
It's the tact is in the reading of the situation, the acting, the responding. It's in the when Steiner talked about the meditatively acquired knowledge of the human being. Meditate, study a man, study, meditate, let that recall, but not in the sense of remember, oh, what did he say about that? But means being able to bring that way of seeing, bring that disposition into play in unpredictable, creative ways. And I think my hesitation about this idea of the teacher as an artist has been that I have witnessed teachers who were so convinced of their own genius that they were
Oh
not
man, yeah, yeah.
they were not aware that the back row had fallen asleep. You know,
Yeah, but you understand
and
that
I understand. I know you're not
I
talking
don't
about that, but
mean this type of teachers. Huh?
yeah, yeah.
So my
So
question is, then
yeah,
I finish. Uh, Education as an art, is that part of the global? Is that part of global?
I think so. I think every culture and every place has to try to find ways of saying what that means.
Mm.
But yeah, of course, it's what if you like, it's one of the virtues.
Yeah,
It's one of the
yeah,
virtues. The virtue is the way we do something,
yeah,
and therefore it is a virtue. Yeah.
yeah.
But I saw Virashni's hand and I saw Tice. I think Virashni was first. I can't actually see her, but
Oh, there I am. Hello, Martin.
you are, Virashni. Hi.
Okay. Hi. As you would know, in South Africa, currently we are trying to create a high school global and South African Waldorf curriculum. And I've been working on it. And firstly, thank you for all the notes and this lecture. It's been immensely helpful. Um, so I just want to describe the situation right now. So having been in a Waldorf teacher for about 20 years, I recognize the traditions in the movement in South Africa. And now out of the residual ashes of post 2020, there is this emergence that's coming. And the generative principles really are the traditional. So my question really is about what I heard you say is that our skills and values need to be identified as generative principles. So please elaborate on that and help me in my understanding, because as I work through the curriculum, I know that there's something essential that's missing in this time. So yes.
Yeah. Um, well, I think other than repeating myself, I think the idea that the way we do something, the values that inform the way we do something, also means the reasons why we do it. Why do we do something? That also works for curriculum. Why do I choose to work with this picture? Why do I choose to read this novel, and so on? Um, if I have those reasons have to have multiple levels to them, including um, the fact that everybody reads this. That's one, that's a tradition. And that I'm disposed, because I think there's no substitute to it, and so on. So as my personal conviction is another level to it. But do the students actually do they open to that is another question. So it would require my virtue would be to be able to read what their response was. Tice, and then I don't know how Shiva, Tice.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your inspiring lecture. Just as a reaction on Christoph Wiegert's comment, think the concept of phronesis um, makes it possible to include the artistic element as like a relational thing. So you had a discussion about it. I feel that it could also be part of the set of values where you're talking about the art, the creativity or art, the artistic element, and then being in the relational, like being between the teacher and the student. You can have that fixed knowledge, but if you come into the classroom, we know that all as teachers, then the whole situation changes because then you have these particular students in front of you, and that make that that your lesson will turn a little bit uh, that will your lesson will be different in the one class than in the other, so to say. So that as a reaction on Christoph, but I was also I thought maybe just as a suggestion, the social threefolding ideology could also maybe be part of that set of values. Do you think so? As then defined as that we strive for like students that are responsible and creative individuals that take their positive or give a positive contribution to the world. I guess that is one of the most central I yeah values in Waldorf education. Do you agree on that, or can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I certainly agree, and that's, if you like, that's within your aims. What are you aiming to do? You're aiming to enable young people to become autonomous, confident people able to make a difference. Yeah.
Yeah,
And so that's a value. That's a value that we bear in mind when we're trying to do things. It's interesting if you come back to this concept of phronesis. It is interesting because phronesis connects to several other concepts, one of which is techne, which is literally the technique, the ability to do something. Another one is poesis, which means to be able to make something useful. And the third one is praxis, which is organizing the social situation in a way that enhances well-being.
yeah,
And
interesting.
those
You
are
said
the,
that
I don't want to get
you
into sort of Greek
you
philosophy.
yeah,
It's a bit
you
about
responded
Greek.
to Christoph like, yeah, what is the teacher making then? But actually, this might be the answer then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
have written about this somewhere else. Shiva, is that the right way of pronouncing it?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your inspiring talk. And uh, I was wondering, like, I just want to share a few things and then I will go to what I feel like for me, it has been a guiding generative principle. And yeah, I was in corporate for more than a decade. And then I came across Waldorf and Steiner education in my early 30s through my daughter's school. And I started teaching, and now it's been almost a decade. And I've taught in India, and then now I'm teaching in Europe. Personally, I have seen that it's important for Waldorf education to become place based. And in the process of decolonizing it, even before I came across this word, in India, I used to constantly say that Steiner was really a person who was against dogma. I think even in one of his lectures, he says it shouldn't be pedantic, something like that. Like, so, and then I saw that in India, it was really a conversation every time we bring things up, like why are we doing Norse mythology? Why are we doing ancient Rome? Why? That question. And then I come to Europe and I have to teach the children here. And how do I bring in the multiple narratives for these children? For me, the path forward is like truly looking at a post humanist world of education. As much as anthropocentric as it sounds, putting the child in the center, the importance of the human being, I think Steiner is constantly saying how we interact with the plant world, the mineral world, and the animal world. I think it's important for us to connect to those things, like things that are really around us. not just the idea of human using everything around us, but just being in harmony with everything around us. Thank you very much. I would like to hear your opinions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm of the same opinion. I think that's what we should strive to do, um, is to open, is to enable children to have rich experience in the world, in the natural world, in the cultural world, and so on. It's our job to enable them to have the kind of rich experience which will transform them. And that makes it, whether one calls it humanist or post-humanist or whatever, that's really what it is. And it's definitely something that speaks to people like parents. I think Jost started his lecture last week about talking how people feel an experience of warmth and come towards Waldorf. I don't think people look at the theory of knowledge underpinning Waldorf and then think, oh, you know, that's a good theory. It's a feeling, it's an affect. In other words, it's a constellation of experiences. Um, but they don't just come from, they're not just kind of, they don't just grow there. They have to be developed. So even warmth has to be developed. It has to be cultivated. It has to be valued and recognized, and we have to do things that generate that. And that's very much part of it. But Bruce, I'd like to give you the word, as they say.
Hi, Martin. Yeah, thank you. Long time no see. Um, I was just going to say, basically, many of us maybe during COVID had to teach online, and we had to do things that we'd have never done before. Maybe some people would say we shouldn't have ever done, but it was just a way of getting to people that one couldn't otherwise do. I was actually already teaching in Kenya, and it was one of the few schools, the Waldorf School in Nairobi, that continued teaching during COVID. A lot of the schools here in Nairobi, they closed down. But now COVID's obviously finished, but I'm still teaching in Waldorf online. And it's just an interesting listening to your amazing lecture, just looking at some of the things that one has to do, has to reinvent, because one's obviously not physically with the students, but reinventing things, you can't use the tool that, as you said, as an apprentice, somebody told you you could use. And it's just amazing thinking at what you'd said on that score. So thank you for your talk. Yeah.
Well, I guess the fact that we're having this meeting online has to do with the experiences that we made during COVID. Yeah, so that's
Yeah,
something
exactly.
that came up.
Yeah, exactly.
Ellen, lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too, and thank you for your talk. I have a question. Your lecture is called How Global is Waldorf Education? And you have traveled a lot, you meet people in different circles, and you said that the Montessori schools have 10,000s, we have just 1,200 about. But how global are we? How are we respected? How are we acknowledged? How are we taken in globally as a pedagogical movement? You know, could you say something about that?
Well, the reason I mentioned Montessori and the whatever it's called, the Soka Gakkai International and so on, which has very, very interesting values, by the way. Education for well-being and happiness, unlocking unlimited potential in each student, dialogue as the method, cultivating global citizens. I mean, they stand for all kinds of interesting things, and it's no wonder that they're present in 190 countries, and is definitely somebody one should look up. 850 of those schools are in Europe. So that kind of answers just, and if you consider that another, I'm not sure, 140 or something in the United States or North America, that's a fairly kind of heavy concentration. And so in that sense, um, in the conventional sense of how well are we seen? Do we play a role? And I
Mm.
think we do play we play a role out of all proportion to our actual numbers, actually, in those countries and in those regions where we aim to do that. So I think in Europe, we are, because we're a large organization and we have the possibility within the European Union to make a difference. And the European Council, Steiner Waldorf Education, is is even funded by the the European Union to exist as an organization because they like to have us as an NGO, non-government organization. We do have a say, um, particularly in the academic world. I mean, the overwhelming majority of literature and scientific stuff is in German, and German does not travel well internationally. English does. And therefore, um, having a presence in the academic world is one area, having a presence in international movements and our networking with UNESCO, with UNICEF, these kinds of organizations is hugely important. Um, that makes us seen, and it always comes down to human relationships. People bump into us, they meet us in meetings, they meet us at conferences and so on, and they think, oh wow, those are interesting people, and they're not so worried or interested that much about the complications of it all. They see here are committed people doing good stuff, and there seems to be a tremendous energy surround it. That always comes over. I sit in this working group of the European Commission working group on schools. I'm the only person in that group who's not I don't work for a government. Everyone else in that is a representative of some education ministry. I'm the only NGO person who's always there. And because I'm the only person who teaches, I do still teach a bit. Um, they say, Martyn, you have practical experience in the classroom. What do you think? And so on. And we do have that, and we need to have it a lot more. My concern is that we're not doing it enough.
Yes.
I think we are, on one hand, understandably involved in survival mode. Everyone's trying to survive. Everyone's got more work and responsibilities than they can carry. We're all completely overloaded. We're also a little bit obsessed with ourselves. We're kind of very focused on the anthroposophical Waldorf world. And in some places in the world, there is a resistance to outreach. The Harvard Congress in a couple of weeks' time, which I have agreed to go to with dubious feelings about what will happen to me at immigration, but it's interesting. There are hardly any Americans there.
Hmm.
Yeah, as a Congress at Harvard University, Faculty of Divinity, Religion, and so on Rudolf Steiner, all kinds of dimensions of it, including Waldorf education. And there are very few Americans. Why? It's right next door because they're not seeking that kind of exposure. My personal, my some people think that I'm trying to water down or even destroy Waldorf. I get attacked probably more than anyone else here in this room. I get personally attacked in publications. I get named as somebody you have to watch out for, as if I'm, the enemy within. I'm undermining. Well, I may be, but it's not my intention. My intention is to do the opposite. My intention is that we make a difference. We have to speak the language that makes a difference. We have to put ourselves in situations where we can make a difference. Not because we think we're better than anybody else, but we do have a good education and we do have good ideas. And it does, and that could the reason I'm still doing this is because I am passionately believe that Waldorf education could make a much bigger difference than it currently is doing. And one of the ways of doing that, just one of them, and it opens doors, is when you publish. And if I can just blatantly post up my over here. There's Crafting a Curriculum of Coherence, Lessons from Waldorf. This is my book with Kath Bransby that is coming out. Routledge commissioned me. Routledge is a major academic publisher in the English-speaking world. They commissioned me to do this book. They said, "What can mainstream learn from Waldorf?" I actually thought, what could Waldorf learn from mainstream as well? And therefore, I've written a book which will not only, people will be surprised in this book because what I'm describing is not regular Waldorf. I think Waldorf could learn a few things there too. Um, but I'm reintroducing a developmental approach. Developmental approach has been absent from the educational discourse for such a long time. Yeah. But what does it mean? It doesn't mean 7-year phases. It doesn't mean that we do Norse mythology in class 4 because that's not developmental, or it's a kind of developmental. There's much more to it than that. And I don't think I'm not as good as some of the other people who publish. I mean, I'm, I fully admit my incompetence and naivety. I just wish more people would put themselves in situations, take the risk of going out there and talking to whoever will listen to us to make a difference. And if I can open door so that more capable people than me can come behind me and take over, that's why I do it. And yes, I have mentioned some uncomfortable things, such as decolonizing, published 2 books on decolonizing. The second one has a wonderful title, Decolonizing Through Waldorf Education. The word through, the preposition through makes a huge difference. It sounds like Waldorf education needs decolonizing. It doesn't, but it can contribute to the whole process of it. And it also means kind of taking kind of risks in a way by putting things into other words. And yeah, that's basically why we have this series of lectures here, because we like to invite people who've got things to say that will make a difference. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was a that was a
No,
little
very good.
a kind of a
Education is a risky business, huh?
it certainly is, yeah. Yeah.
But I think through a common understanding, we can make a common denominator and common understanding. And I think in the way globally we work with Waldorf education in the different countries today in the world, it's very different from how it was 20 years ago. We don't have an imperialistic attitude to how to bring Waldorf education about. And I think that has changed a lot.
It has.
Thank
It
you.
has. It has. Yeah. And there are countries which are where Waldorf is so robust, like Norway, that we will education policies always go against the direction that makes sense. It's kind of what happens. And then you need a robust education movement that can stand up and say, well, okay, you have a point, but we actually have several other points, and we can make a case for it. Yeah. So if my brain was as capable as my mouth, then I would know what next week's talk is going to be. I'm sure somebody at
I think it's
headquarters
Sven.
knows.
No,
I
next
think
week
it's
is
Sven.
Ulrike
Sven
Sievers.
Saar.
Next week is
Oh,
Ulrike.
yeah?
Right. Okay. I
Yeah,
know her. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's about how future fit is Waldorf.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
There was one final question, but Gabby, could
I
you
can
mind?
answer it in 30 seconds, like by
Okay.
saying yes or no. Yeah.
Okay. Da. Good morning from Auckland, New Zealand. What might it take for Waldorf to evolve in ways that make a greater difference in the world today? That's from Gabby. It's above the one, which was a little bit longer.
Well, Waldorf schools could be a lot more inclusive than they are in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
And secondly, they need to be as professional as they need to be to make a difference. Yeah. But those are very superficial statements to make. Yeah. I'd like to thank you all for coming at this late or early hour of whatever time of day you're at. It's great to have so many people here. And we know that many other people, for example, all the students and on the master's program in China, don't stay up to watch this, but they had a session earlier on today. All 30 students on the master's program in China had a meeting with me earlier today to discuss Jost's lecture. So that's also what we do here. Good. Then I wish you all good working, and we'll bump
Thank you,
into
Martyn.
some of you on the way.
Thank you so